Hello, and welcome to the Section 1.4 video lecture for statistics. Once again, I'm Dr. Scott Spaniel, your instructor for this course. Um, Today, as promised, we're going to talk about, in the Section 1.3 video, we're going to talk about different types of sampling other than simple random. So these are other techniques that we can use for sampling that have their time and place and can be very useful in different situations. So as always, go ahead and take out your 1.4 lecture notes if you want to follow along. These can be found under this week link in the week link in Blackboard or on my math lab, depending on the setup of your course. So there are basically, well, let's go ahead and talk about these. So a blank is obtained by separating the population into non-overly, a stratified sample is obtained by separating the population into non-overlapping groups called strata, and then obtaining a simple random sample from each stratum. The individuals within each stratum should be homogeneous in some way, so they should be the same in some way. So the goal behind stratified sampling is to break people up into groups based on some characteristic, such as political affiliation, religion, ethnicity, and then ask them all questions. So we use stratified sampling when we think different groups of people will respond differently. One really good example of this is, and we want to make sure we get enough people from each group. So one good example of this is political surveys. We're probably going to get different responses based on party affiliation. So it's useful to make sure we sample people from each party. A systematic sample is obtained by selecting every kth individual from the population. The first individual selected corresponds to a random number between 1 and k. So this is most useful in manufacturing. If you want to do quality control, one of the best ways to do it is take every 100th item off the line and make sure that it works. There are other times to use this, but that's one of the most common. So you basically are asking every so many people or looking at every so many items. A cluster sample is obtained by selecting all individuals within a randomly selected collection or group of individuals. So, cluster is fairly similar to stratified, and here we have two pictures of these two. So in stratified, we break the population up into groups, and then we select a random sample from every group. For cluster, we break the population up into groups, and then we randomly select groups to sample. So the most common use of this is something like at the school, we do at the college, we do a couple different surveys. One is a class climate survey, and one is a campus climate survey. And in both those cases, what they do is they sample whole random classes. So they randomly select classes, and then they sample the students in those classes. But the biggest difference here, and the way to tell these two apart, is are we randomly selecting groups or are we randomly selecting people from each group? So this is people from each group. And in this one, we're randomly selecting the groups. So that's the difference between stratified and cluster. A convenience sample is a sample in which individuals are easily attained and not based on randomness. So like if you decided to survey everybody in your apartment building, because unless your question is specific to your apartment building, that would be convenient. If I decided to sample my class to find out the opinion of all college students, that would be a convenient sample because you're a group of people who are convenient to me. Under convenience sample, there's a type of survey that goes beyond that. So individuals in a sample are self-selected if the individuals themselves decide to participate in the survey. These are also called voluntary response surveys or response samples. Okay. And one thing beyond this, you could do multiple stages to sampling. So you could group and use more than one type of sampling within your sampling technique. So, for example, you could do a cluster sample and then do a simple random sample. So cluster and randomly select groups and then randomly select people from each group to even make your groups even smaller if you're talking about a really big population. So the first thing we want to be able to do is we want to make sure we can understand the difference between these, recognize the difference. So we'll do a few of these together, and then I'll have you try a few. So identify the type of sampling used. So to estimate the percentage of defects in a recent manufacturing batch, a quality control manager at Intel selects every 8th chip that comes off the assembly line, starting with the 3rd until she obtains a sample of 140 chips. So this is systematic. And we can tell it's systematic because she's selecting every so many items. Okay. To determine the prevalence of human growth hormone, HGH, use among high school varsity baseball players, the State Athletic Commission randomly selects 50 high schools, and all members of the selected high school's varsity baseball team are tested for HGH. So this is cluster sampling. And the key thing that made it cluster sampling is that all members of the selected high school's varsity baseball teams were tested. So they randomly selected some high schools, and then they tested everybody from those high schools or on the baseball team at those high schools. So a member of Congress wishes to determine her constituency's opinion regarding estate taxes. She divides her constituency into 3 income classes: low-income households, middle-income households, and upper-income households. She then takes a simple random sample of households from each income class. So this would be stratified because she is randomly selecting from each group. So they were put into groups, and then a random sample was taken from each group rather than a random sample of the groups. The next one, a radio station asks listeners to call in their opinion regarding the use of forces in U.S. peacekeeping missions. So this would be convenience because they're not randomly selecting anybody. They're simply asking for people already listening to their show to call in and tell them their opinion. And then the last one we'll do together. In an effort to identify an advertising campaign has been effective, a marketing firm conducts a nationwide poll by randomly selected individuals from a list of known users of the product. So this is the type of sampling we talked about in the last section, which is simple random. Because they have a list of people and they're randomly selecting off that list. Okay, so at this point, go and pause the video for a moment and try these other 6, and when you're done, hit play and we'll go through them together. Okay, so now that you've had a chance to try these, let's talk about them. So to determine customer opinion of its boarding policy, Southwest Airlines randomly selects 60 flights during a certain week and surveys all the passengers. So hopefully you got cluster for that one. And the key is they randomly selected 60 flights, so they randomly selected groups, and then they surveyed all the passengers. The next one says, a survey regarding download time on a certain website is administered on the internet by a market research firm to anyone who would like to take it. So that would be convenience, because those people are self-selected. So remember, self-selected falls under the bigger banner of convenience. So that's a convenience sample. 24-Hour Fitness wants to administer a satisfaction survey to its current members. Using its membership roster, the club randomly selects 40 club members and asks them about their level of satisfaction with the club. So in this case, this is simple random because they have a population, which is their membership, and they randomly select members from that entire population. The next one, the president of a guest lecture series at a university stands outside the auditorium before a lecture begins and hands every 5th person who arrives, beginning with the 3rd, a speaker evaluation survey to be completed and returned at the end of the program. So that's systematic. Okay, because we're sampling every kth person. A farmer divides his orchard into 50 subsections, randomly selects 4, and samples all the trees within the 4 subsections to approximate the yield of his orchard. So that would be cluster. Again, because he's randomly selecting groups and then he's sampling all the things within that group. And then the last one is a school official divides the student population into 5 classes: freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and graduate student. The official takes a simple random sample from each class and asks the members' opinions regarding student services. So that would be stratified, because he's breaking them into groups and then randomly selecting from each group. Okay. So those are the different types and how to recognize which type of sampling is occurring. Now let's look a little bit more in depth about how we would actually do some of these samplings. So here's a good example of a case where you might want to use stratified sampling. So the owner of a private food store is concerned about employee morale. She decides to survey the managers and hourly employees to see if she can learn about work environment and job satisfaction. From the list of workers at the store, obtain a stratified sample of 2 managers and 4 hourly employees to survey. So the reason you might want to use a stratified sample in a situation like this is the managers and hourly employees probably have different opinions about workplace morale. And if you want to make sure that you hear from all of them, you want to use a sampling technique that makes sure you get people in the sample who are managers and people in the sample who are hourly employees. If you don't do that, it's very possible that all of the people in your sample could be one or the other. So the way you would do this is you would need to figure out how many people are in the sample. So for managers, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we can label them, each with a number, and then just do a simple random sample of those 8 people. So we could use technology for this, right? We did this in the last video. So in this case, I want to go from 1 to 8. And I need 2 of them. And so, except I'm using random number because that's what I brought up at the end of the last video. So stat, advanced, random int, 1, 8, 2. And in this case, we got the numbers 6 and 2. So that would be Orsina and Hills. And if you were to do this on your own at home using ClassCalc, it's completely possible that you would get 2 very different answers. So if we did the same thing for hourly employees, we could get 1. You want to label them first. And the reason you want to label them first is if you label them after you randomly select the numbers, it's possible that you could bias it by labeling these in a way that gives you the sample you want. In this case, we've got 21. So if I use my random number integer generator on my calculator, I want to go from 1 to 21, and I want 4 numbers. So I get 16, 4, 7, and 6. So 16, 4, 7, and 6. Okay, so that's the idea. So that's how these work. Another good example, which I'm not going to do, but that would fit this as well, is an example of if you are dealing with political opinions and you want, in this case, they want a panel. So they want to make sure the panel is balanced. So they want to get 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. So you want to make sure that you're sampling from both groups, because it's once again very possible that you wouldn't have a balanced panel if you just randomly selected members of this club. It's very easy. You could get 3 of one and 1 of the other, or all 4 of one and none of the other. Okay, the more complicated type of this to do, cluster, stratified, and cluster and stratified both are basically just making groups and then doing a simple random sample, which is something we've done. We did simple random sampling in the last section. With systematic, we get a slightly different type of sampling that we should definitely do some practice with. So, if possible, okay, so to do systematic sampling, the first thing you want to do is, if possible, approximate the population size that you're dealing with. Then you want to determine the sample size desired and then compute capital N divided by lowercase n and round down to the nearest integer. This is the value of k. Okay? Randomly select a number between 1 and k, call this number p. The sample will consist of the following individuals: p, p plus k, p plus k, which is p plus 2k, And then we're going to keep going up until we get P plus N minus 2 times K and P plus N minus 1 times K. And we're going to add K one less than our sample size, because if I added K our sample size, I would end up with one extra person, right? In this case, in this first example, if I wanted to get 130 people in my sample and I start with P and I add K 130 times, well, then I end up with P and 130 extra people, which is 131. So we want to add K one less than our sample size. Okay. And this actually gives us a formula for finding, well, let's start this example and then I'll say what I was going to say. So to figure this out, the first thing we have to do is figure out what K is. Well, K is capital N divided by lowercase n and then rounded down. So in this case, we have a capital N of 945,035 and a sample size of 130. So our K is 945035. I think. Let me check that just to make sure. Yep. Divided by 130. And we can see that that's 7,269.5, but we want to make sure we round down. So we're just basically going to lop off the decimal. And so we're just going to get rid of the decimal here. And so this is, in this case, that's going to be 7,269. Okay. Now what we want to do is we want to figure out what P is. Now in this case, they tell us what P is, so we all get the same answers. But in general, if I wanted to figure out what P is, I could use my calculator. I would go to my random integer, and I would go between 1 and 7,269, and I only want one number. Okay, and that one number is 4,266. But in this case, they told us all where to start, so we all get the same answers. And they want the first five participants. So that's fairly easy to do. To find the first 5 participants, we're just going to start with 708, the first one, and then we're just going to add K 4 times to get the next numbers, right? So the next number in our list is going to be 708 plus 7,269, and that will give us our second number. Okay, so I could do all of these in my calculator. Now, one of the things we haven't done with our calculator yet is I can switch over to scientific mode since I'm just doing some addition. So 708 plus 7,269 is 7977. And then I can take 7977 plus 7269, and that gives me my next number. And then add it again. Oops, that didn't work because I forgot a 9. That's what happened. Okay, and then add it again. And there are my other 4 numbers. Okay, so 7977 15246 22515 and 29784. Now the interesting thing here is we can use this formula to actually find any number we wanted. So like, for example, if I wanted to find the 101st participant, I would just want to add K 100 times, right? Because the first participant I didn't add K, and then I'm going to need to add K 100 times beyond that to get what I'm looking for. So that would just be P plus N my number minus 1 times K. So just plug this number in for N and plug in P and K. So that would be 708 plus 101 minus 1 times 7,269. Okay, so 708 plus 101 minus 1 times 7,269, which is 727,608. And now, let's say I wanted to find the 102nd person, or let's say I wanted to find the 100th person. I could use this formula again, or I can just subtract k from that number. So if I just subtract k from this number that I just found, that would tell me the 100th person. So 720,339. Okay, so that would be the idea. So that should all allow you now the information you need to attempt this bottom problem. So take a few minutes and try doing the bottom one here. Go ahead and pause the video, and we'll go through it when you hit play. Okay, so now that you've tried it, let's try it together. So the Human Resources Department at a certain company wants to conduct a survey regarding worker morale. The department has an alphabetic list of all 4,502 employees at the company and wants to conduct a systematic sample. Determine K. So K, remember, is the sample size, the population size divided by the sample size. So 4,502 divided by 50. In this case, that's 90.04. We lop off the decimal, and K is 90. Okay, in this case, if we assume P is 35, it wants us to find the last 5 participants. Well, as we discussed, we can find any participant we want. So in this case, let's say I wanted to find, let's start with the last participant. So the last participant is going to be our P, which is 35, plus 50 minus 1 times K, times 90, right? Because we are going to, we want 50 total, so that's our N. So that's the number we're looking for. So the last participant is the 50th one. So 35 plus 50 minus 1 times 90 is 4,445. And now if we want to get the last 5, we can just work backwards from there by subtracting K. So there's one answer. So then subtract 90, and that'll give us the second one. And we can just do that 4 times. So minus 90 is 4,355. Okay, so 4,355. And we would just continue to subtract 90. So the next one's 4,265, and then 4,175, and then 4,085. Okay. Yeah, and that's all we're going to do with this for today. So that should get you a good start on the homework. Don't forget to do the homework and the quiz. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me using the Remind app or using email.